Zuri sat in the cool, polished room in Ikoyi and kept her hands on her knees so they would not shake. She was a nurse from Ikoko who knew how to hold herself steady, but today felt different. Tun's family filled the leather chairs, whispering and sniffing like they already smelled money. When the lawyer read that Zuri would receive $1, Tun's mother burst into a long, high ululation that sliced the room. A few cousins laughed. Someone hissed, "Serves her right." Zuri stared at the single coin on the table as if it were a joke told in a language she did not speak. She felt heat rise behind her eyes, but she held her chin up. She had walked people through pain worse than this. She would not cry. The lawyer, a calm man with careful eyes, closed the file and said the session was over. As relatives surged around him, he moved close to Zuri without looking at her directly and slipped a sealed envelope into her palm. It was thick and heavy, with 24 hours written across the front in clean blue ink. For a second, the room faded and all she heard was her breath. Zuri slid the envelope into her bag, stood, and walked out past Tun's mother, who was still smiling like victory tasted sweet. Outside, the sun hit her face, hot and bright. A single $1. An envelope with a timer on it. Zuri took a long breath and told herself to wait until midnight. Then she would listen. Then she would know. Midnight came like a held breath. Zuri sat on her small couch, the envelope heavy in her bag, the room lit by a single lamp and the city sounds far away. She waited until the clock clicked 12, then took the envelope out with hands that did not quite feel steady. There was a strip of paper tucked inside with numbers and a code. When she typed the code into her phone, a voice note began to play and Tun's voice filled the tiny room, rougher and softer than she remembered. He said, "If you are hearing this, truth is bigger than pride," and for a second she could not move. His voice told her where to go, gave her coordinates to a cliffside road in Takoradi, and his words stumbled sometimes as if he had practiced saying them 1,000 times and still could not say enough. The note talked about mistakes and the fear of dying with things left unsaid. It was not blame. It was a map and a question. Zuri pressed the phone to her chest and felt the old, complicated ache, but there was also a strange lightness, as if a window had opened in a locked room. She checked the coordinates again and then packed a small bag. She thought about staying, about calling someone, but she knew she had to go alone. At dawn she was on a bus to Takoradi. The road moved under the tires and the sky slowly turned pale. She watched fields and small shops and fishermen preparing nets. The town smelled of salt and oil. She felt tired and oddly steady. At the cliffside road a man waited where the map said he would. He was the lawyer from the will reading, Advocate Mensa, but his suit was less formal in the early light and his face looked softer than the memory of the courtroom. He did not smile. He held out a small keyring and when he opened his hand Zuri saw 2 letters engraved on the metal, AZ, neat and plain, like a promise. The keyring felt warm because he had held it, and it made her think of small, careful things that mean a lot. Mensa said nothing about the ululation or the $1. He simply said he had followed Tun's instructions and that the estate had to stay secret until the right moment. The wind moved the grass along the cliff and gulls cried far below. Mensa handed her a folded paper with the address and a short line that read, "Open only with this key." His voice was low and urgent and for the first time since the will reading Zuri let herself imagine that Tund had planned more than a spiteful final joke. She felt both angry and light at the same time. The journey from Ikoko to Takoradi had been long and rough, but somehow this felt like the point where something could change. Mensa watched her with a look that mixed sympathy and duty. He said, "You have 24 hours, which was odd because she already had the envelope, but she nodded and held the keyring as if it were a rope. The cliff stretched out, the sky opened, and Zuri stepped forward toward a gate she had not yet seen and toward a secret that smelled of salt and old promises. The gate was almost hidden under green vines, a wall of leaves that looked like it had been guarding the place for years. Zuri felt her breath catch when Mensa reached out and fitted the AZ keyring into a small rusted padlock. The security guard at the booth glanced up, then his face changed like someone recognizing the name of a person they had once known. He waved them through without a question, and the gravel road rolled past tall palms until the house rose up, half swallowed by the morning light. A sign on the gate read Amina House in simple letters, and Zuri's throat tightened when she read her mother's name. It felt impossible and right at the same time. The mansion stood back from the beach, white and wide, with windows like thoughtful eyes. Mensa led her inside where a small room opened into a long gallery. On the walls, photos filled the space. Tund laughing at a barbecue, Tund in a hospital gown holding Zuri's mother's hand, Tund and a woman handing out bread to children, Tund signing papers in a lawyer's office. The pictures were ordinary and quiet, nothing like the loud shows of wealth Zuri had expected from Ikoyi. Each frame had a little note in Tund's handwriting. One said simply, "After chemo, we talked." Another said, "For Amina, who taught me how to keep promises." Zuri's fingers went cold as she moved along the gallery and saw a photo of Tund with a tired, relieved smile, the scar in his hairline still pale. Mensa did not rush her. He opened a safe with a small key and pulled out a thick envelope of documents, a hotel receipt from the day he left the hospital, and a letter that began, "Zuri, I was wrong." The photos and papers told the story Tund had not allowed to be known at the funeral. He had quietly bought the house after he beat cancer. He had met with lawyers in secret, transferred money in small amounts so no one would notice, and he had planned a life there named for Zuri's mother because he wanted a fresh start. The gallery also had a picture clipped to the wall that did not fit with the others, Tund smiling in a crowded room with a woman whose hand rested too easily on his arm. Zuri felt the old sting when she saw it, the memory of betrayal that had made her walk away. Mensa watched her closely and then handed her more proof, bank transfers, email threads where Tund argued to make amends, and a voice memo where he said he had hoped she would come even if he could not promise she should stay. Everything in that room moved like a slow tide, pulling up truth and memory together. Zuri stood in the light, the name Amina House shining at her back, and for the first time the story was whole. She had been left $1 in public and given a house in private. The truth was there on the walls, patient and heavy, asking her what she would do next. Mensa closed the gallery doors softly and sat across from Zuri as if they were two people who needed to speak plainly at last. He pointed to a paper on the table and said, "Clause 19. The words felt small and heavy. He explained that the $1 had not been cruelty. It was a decoy meant to show who cheered and who schemed. The true will, he said, only came alive if the person it named showed up at the exact place and time Tund had set. Zuri listened while the sunlight from the windows cut across the table and the house smelled faintly of salt and old books. Mensa unlocked a larger safe and pulled out thick files tied with string. He laid them out like evidence on a stage, the master deed that put Amina House in Zuri's name, paperwork creating a trust for the businesses in Lekki and Mombasa, diagrams of company ownership, and accounts showing how Tund moved money quietly so the transfer would not be shouted about at the funeral. There were also letters written in Tund's hand. He had written to Zuri again and again, saying he was sorry and that he had tried to fix the harm he caused. The letters were small and honest, not grand apologies, but they showed him trying to be better. Then Mensa handed her a folder with a different weight to it. Inside were bank statements and messages that did not look like private mistakes but like a plan. They showed the mistress receiving funds through shell accounts and invoices that were fake. There were messages between the mistress and Chaik, Tund's cousin, arranging transfers and whispering about taking over parts of the business once Tund was gone. Zuri felt each paper like a cold hand on her shoulder. The proof was clear and ugly. Mensa explained how Clause 19 had been written to catch that greed. If Zuri did not show, the decoy would let the greedy move in and claim shares. Because she had come, all those secret lines of ownership and those fake invoices were void. The trust activated. The trustee named by Tund had power to freeze accounts and to move assets into legal protection. Mensa watched Zuri as the sentences landed. He spoke about next steps in quiet, precise words: file injunctions, secure the companies, open the trust, and start audits to recover stolen funds. Zuri read each document with a steady hand. Her face did not break into relief or triumph yet. She felt something else, sharp and steady, like a spine straightening. Tund had given her more than a house. He had given her responsibility and a map to undo wrongs. The room felt both empty and full. Outside, the sea moved as if nothing in the world had changed, but on the table lay the papers that would make the world change for Zuri and for the people who had smiled when they thought she had nothing. Zuri read the last page twice with the sunlight on her hands, and then she closed the folder slowly because she needed to feel the words again. The will did not ask her to forgive. It asked her to be smart with what she had been given. It said she should use the money and the businesses to build something that lasted, not to feed old fights. She felt a strange calm at that sentence, like a small lamp lit inside her chest. That afternoon she sent a short note to every relative who had been at the funeral and told them to come to Amina house at 5. She did not explain why. On the terrace she set out chairs and coffee and let the sea make a steady sound while the family gathered, proud and curious in the way people are when they expect victory. When they sat, Zuri stood at the head of the table and spoke in a voice that did not shake. She told them she would not beg and she would not be bought. Then she pressed play on a laptop and let the screen fill with images. The security footage showed private calls in a car, a cousin counting envelopes behind a curtain, 2 people laughing as they spoke about changing signatories, a plan to move money the moment papers were signed. Faces that had smiled across the funeral now looked small and nervous in the grainy light. Gasps ran along the terrace like a wind. Some tried to speak. Zuri waited until they were quiet and then she handed a stack of papers to the senior ones, the kind that looked for loopholes in law and sympathy in strangers. They were court injunctions, sealed and real, freezing bank accounts and blocking transfers. There were also orders to reclaim money taken by false invoices and shell companies. Mensa had prepared them, he had worked through the night. Zuri watched as color left their faces, as they realized the game had been found out. She did not shout or celebrate. She read the most important lines aloud. The businesses would be audited, the stolen funds would be returned, and any attempt to move assets would meet the law. When a cousin reached for his phone to call a friend, Mensa quietly stood and took it with a calm hand. Zuri felt no triumph, only a clear sense of duty. She promised the workers in Lekki and Mombasa that their pay and jobs would be safe, and she told the family that if they wanted a chance to make amends, they could do it through the courts, not through whispers. As the sun set and the lights on the terrace warmed the faces that had once mocked her, Zuri felt the house shift around her, not because of money but because truth had been given a place to land. She folded the injunctions into neat stacks, placed them on the table, and walked inside, already thinking about audits and meetings, knowing that this was the moment when quiet work would undo loud wrongdoing. Zuri spent the first weeks after the injunctions working like someone who had finally been handed a map and knew which roads to take. She flew to Enugu and walked the floors of Tund's logistics company, talking to drivers, clerks and managers in plain language, asking where things broke and where people were trusted. She did not come with grand promises. She listened, then tightened loose processes, added honest bookkeeping, and put young, sharp people in roles they had only dreamed of. She reached out to communities she knew well and hired talented young leaders from Kibra and Ajagunal, people who understood hard work and could speak to the neighborhoods where many of the company's staff lived. The change was practical and fast. New rostering systems meant drivers had steady routes and steady pay, cash leaks stopped, and managers learned to report problems instead of hiding them. Back at Amina House she signed papers to create the Amina Foundation in her mother's name, a small but steady organization focused on women's clinics and mental health support. The foundation started with one clear rule: be kind and be useful. It funded a clinic near Makoko that offered free checkups and maternity care, and it hired nurses who had grown up in places like Zuri's neighborhood so patients felt at home. She turned the mansion's guest wing into a shelter for women escaping violence or homelessness, simple rooms with warm sheets and a kitchen that smelled of fresh food. There were counseling sessions in the morning and job training in the afternoons. Zuri met each woman, learned her story, and then used the company's logistics to help move donated goods into the shelter and take graduates to interviews. The media smelled a good headline and soon cameras came. Reporters loved the contrast between a $1 public inheritance and the real life behind the papers. They called her the $1 heiress, a phrase that stuck because it captured the shock and the unexpected power she now held. The nickname pushed attention to the projects, which brought more donors and more helpers. Zuri did interviews in honest, low-key ways, always steering the conversation back to the women and the workers. She refused to let the story be about revenge. Instead, she talked about steady work, safe pay, and small clinics that could mean the difference between life and death for a mother. At night she still walked the terrace and watched the sea, thinking about Tund and the strange way the world had turned. She felt tired, yes, but also sure that the work mattered. The money and the mansion were tools, not trophies. She had a list of meetings and a pile of audits to sign, but she slept better than she had in years, because for the first time she ran something that did good on purpose, not by accident. The night felt soft, the ocean breathing against the sand as lanterns swung along the shore and threw warm circles of light across the terrace. People had gathered quietly, workers and women from the shelter, a few neighbors, and the small team who had helped Zuri steady the businesses. She held a thin sheet of paper in her hand and a pen that seemed heavier than it should. Before she signed, she read aloud the last line Tund had left, his voice in writing like a small, stubborn truth: "I wanted you to win, even without me." The words landed in the night and made a few people close their eyes. A woman from the shelter, the first to arrive after fleeing a small town, sat near the lanterns with her child asleep in her lap. Zuri felt the room bend toward that woman, toward the quiet life that would grow from this moment. She signed the document that transferred a penthouse in Lagos to the shelter as a permanent home for survivors who needed a real fresh start, not a temporary roof. Cameras were there, but they seemed far away and small compared to the faces around her. At the gate, beyond the wall of palms, Tund's family watched. They stood in a line, too far to touch the light, their faces lit by the glow and by something like regret. They had expected a show of weakness or anger, but what they saw instead was a steady hand giving what it should have already been. Zuri did not look at them when she put the pen down. She folded the papers and handed a copy to the woman with the child. The woman pressed Zuri's hand to her heart and began to cry, a sound that was not shame or sorrow but relief. Lanterns burned brighter for a moment, then grew steady. Zuri walked through the open door of Amina house into rooms that smelled like fresh linen and salt. The gate behind her stayed open for a long time, and the faces at it remained small in the dark. She closed the door gently, not to shut them out but to step in. The lights inside glowed steady against the night, and for the first time in a long time Zuri felt the future waiting for her with a clear, simple promise.